The radio crackled to life in the command tent, cutting through the humid Afghan morning air like a knife. Colonel Marcus Reed looked up from his tactical maps, his weathered face bearing the lines of 23 years in the Marine Corps. The voice coming through was crisp, professional, and unmistakably female. Base Command, this is Phantom 7 requesting immediate extraction coordinates for wounded personnel. We have multiple casualties and are taking heavy fire from fortified positions. Reed grabbed the handset, his mind already calculating distances and available resources. The voice had an edge to it that spoke of real combat experience, not the nervous tension of someone facing their first firefight. He'd heard thousands of radio transmissions over the years, and this one carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what they were doing under pressure. Phantom 7, this is Base Command. State your location and casualty count. Base Command, we're approximately 2 clicks northeast of Checkpoint Bravo. I have 3 Kia, 7 wounded, 2 critical. Enemy forces have us pinned down with mortars and small arms fire from elevated positions. We need close air support and medical evacuation immediately. Reed's eyes narrowed as he studied the map. That sector had been relatively quiet for the past week. Intelligence reports hadn't indicated any significant Taliban presence in the area. Either their information was wrong, or Phantom 7 had stumbled into something unexpected. Phantom 7, confirm your unit designation and commanding officer. There was a brief pause, and Reed could hear the distinctive sound of incoming mortar rounds in the background, followed by shouted orders and the sharp crack of return fire. Base Command, this is Captain Sarah Chen, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. Phantom 7 is my call sign. We were conducting a routine patrol when we discovered a weapons cache. Enemy forces initiated contact approximately 30 minutes ago. Reed felt something cold settle in his stomach. Captain Sarah Chen. The name hit him like a physical blow, and, for a moment, he couldn't breathe. His hand tightened on the radio handset as memories came flooding back, memories he'd spent years trying to bury. 15 years ago, in another war, in another desert, there had been another Captain Chen. First Lieutenant Sarah Chen, fresh out of officer candidate school, assigned to his company in Iraq. She'd been eager, brilliant, and absolutely fearless. She'd also been the reason Reed had nearly lost his career and his marriage. Sir? His communications sergeant was looking at him with concern. Sir, Phantom 7 is requesting immediate support. Reed shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. Whatever had happened between him and Sarah Chen 15 years ago, there were Marines in the field who needed his help right now. Personal history would have to wait. Phantom 7, we're scrambling close air support. ETA 15 minutes. Can you hold your position? Negative, Base Command. Enemy forces are maneuvering to flank our position. We're going to have to move to higher ground. There's a ridgeline approximately 500 meters to our south. We'll establish a defensive perimeter there. Reed could hear the tactical thinking in her voice, the same sharp intelligence that had impressed him so much years ago. Sarah had always been able to read a battlefield like a chessmaster reading a board, seeing moves and countermoves that others missed. Phantom 7, be advised we're tracking multiple hostile signatures moving toward your location. You've got approximately 40 enemy combatants converging on your position from multiple directions. Understood, Base Command. We're moving now. The radio went quiet except for the constant static, and Reed found himself staring at the handset as if it might provide answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. Sarah Chen. After all these years, after everything that had happened, she was back in his life, and she was in danger. His aide, Lieutenant Morrison, appeared at his elbow with a situation report. Sir, we've got 2 Apache helicopters airborne, ETA 12 minutes. Medical evacuation is standing by at forward operating base Delta. What are your orders regarding ground support? Reed studied the tactical display, his mind working through the possibilities. The area where Sarah's unit was pinned down was treacherous terrain, full of caves and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover for insurgent forces. A ground assault would be costly and time-consuming. Air support was their best option, but even that would be dangerous with friendly forces so close to enemy positions.
Get me Captain Rodriguez from Alpha Company. I want his unit ready to move as backup if the air support isn't sufficient. And contact the forward air controller.
I want to personally coordinate the close air support mission. Sir, with respect, that's not standard protocol for a colonel to. I know what the protocol is, Lieutenant. I also know that Marines are dying out there, and I'm not going to sit in this tent pushing papers while they fight for their lives.
Morrison nodded and moved away to carry out his orders.
Reed turned back to the radio, adjusting the frequency to the close air support channel. His hands were steady, but, inside, his mind was racing.
Sarah Chan.
The woman who had nearly destroyed his marriage, the woman who had saved his life in Fallujah, the woman who had disappeared from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. The radio crackled again.
Base Command, this is Phantom 7. We've reached the ridgeline and established a defensive perimeter.
Enemy forces are approximately 300 meters out and closing.
We need that air support now. Phantom 7, Viper 1-1 is 2 minutes out. Paint your targets with laser designation. Roger, Base Command. Targets designated. Enemy positions are marked with infrared strobes.
Reed grabbed the radio for the air support frequency.
Viper 1-1, this is Base Command. You are cleared hot on designated targets. Phantom 7 has friendlies in close proximity.
Danger close protocols are in effect.
Base Command, Viper 1-1 copies danger close. Beginning attack run now.
Through his binoculars, Reed could see the distant ridgeline where Sarah's unit had taken position. Smoke was rising from several points, and the sound of sustained gunfire echoed across the valley. The Apache helicopters appeared as small dots against the sky, growing larger as they approached the target area.
Viper 1-1, this is Phantom 7. Enemy forces are advancing under cover of smoke.
I count approximately 20 hostiles moving up the eastern slope toward our position. Reed watched as the lead Apache rolled into its attack run, 30mm cannon rounds walking across the rocky slope in a line of destruction. Secondary explosions indicated that the enemy had been carrying RPGs or other explosive devices.
Good hits, Viper 1-1. That's taken out the eastern advance.
But we've got more movement to the north and west. The second Apache swung wide, positioning itself for a flanking attack on the remaining enemy forces. Reed found himself gripping the radio handset so tightly his knuckles were white. Every fiber of his being wanted to be out there, fighting alongside the unit, protecting Sarah and her Marines.
Base Command, this is Phantom 7.
Enemy resistance is decreasing, but I still have 2 critical casualties who need immediate medical attention.
What's the ETA on medical evacuation? Reed checked his watch and consulted with his medical officer. Phantom 7, dust-off is inbound, ETA 4 minutes. Can you secure a landing zone? Affirmative, Base Command. We'll clear the top of the ridge for landing.
Be advised, there may still be scattered enemy forces in the area. The next few minutes passed in a blur of radio transmissions and tactical updates. Reed coordinated the medical evacuation while maintaining communication with both the air support and Sarah's ground unit. Finally, the report he'd been waiting for came through.
Base Command, this is Dustoff 27. We have all casualties aboard and are returning to base. Phantom 7 reports area secure.
Reed felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, but he knew this wasn't over. There would be debriefings, after-action reports, and, eventually, he would have to face Sarah Chin in person. The thought both thrilled and terrified him.
Phantom 7, this is Base Command. Outstanding work out there. RTB when ready. Roger, Base Command. Phantom 7 returning to base.
Reed set down the radio and walked outside the command tent. The Afghan sun was climbing higher, promising another scorching day. In a few hours, Sarah's unit would be back at the forward operating base, and he would see her face to face for the first time in 15 years. He thought about Iraq, about the young lieutenant who had saved his life during a patrol in Fallujah. He thought about the long nights in the green zone, talking about tactics and strategy and dreams for the future. He thought about the moment when professional admiration had turned into something more dangerous, something that had nearly cost him everything he'd worked for.
Sarah had been married then, to another Marine officer stationed stateside.
Reed had been married too, to Rebecca, his college sweetheart who had already given him 2 children. What had happened between them had been brief, intense, and ultimately destructive. When it ended, Sarah had requested a transfer to another unit, and Reed had never seen her again.
Until now.
The sound of approaching helicopters drew his attention skyward.
3 Black Hawks were visible on the horizon, growing larger as they approached the landing zone. One would be carrying Sarah's unit back to base. In less than an hour, he would have to look into the eyes of the woman who had once meant everything to him, and pretend that she was just another officer under his command. Reed straightened his uniform and walked back into the command tent. There would be time for personal reckonings later. Right now, he had a base to run and Marines to protect. But, as he picked up the next situation report, his mind kept drifting back to that voice on the radio, crisp and professional and unmistakably Sarah's. Phantom 7.
Even her call sign carried echoes of the past, of the woman who had appeared in his life like a ghost and disappeared just as quickly. Now she was back, and Reed had no idea what that meant for either of them. The helicopters were landing now, and Reed could see figures disembarking in the distance. Somewhere among them was Captain Sarah Chen, and, after 15 years, he was about to discover whether time had healed old wounds or simply made them deeper. Captain Sarah Chen stepped off the Black Hawk helicopter with the practiced ease of someone who had made hundreds of similar landings. The rotor wash whipped sand and debris around the landing zone, but she barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on her Marines, ensuring that the wounded were properly transferred to the medical team and that her remaining personnel were accounted for.
3 body bags lay on stretchers nearby, silent testimony to the morning's firefight. Sarah's jaw tightened as she watched them being loaded into a separate transport.
Corporals Martinez, Johnson, and Private First Class Williams. Good Marines, all of them, who had followed her orders without question and paid the ultimate price. The weight of their death settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden, one she'd carried too many times before. "Ma'am, Colonel Reed wants to see you for debriefing as soon as you're ready," said Lieutenant Morrison, appearing at her elbow with a clipboard full of forms. Sarah nodded, her mind still processing the name.
Colonel Reed.
She'd noticed it on the radio communications, but, in the heat of battle, she hadn't had time to think about it properly. Now, walking across the dusty compound toward the command center, the implications hit her like a physical blow.
Marcus Reed.
The man who had been her commanding officer in Iraq 15 years ago. The man who had saved her career during her first deployment. The man who had nearly destroyed her marriage and her life. After all these years, after all the careful planning she'd done to avoid serving in his theater of operations, fate had placed them in the same forward operating base. Sarah paused outside the command tent, taking a moment to compose herself. She'd spent 15 years building a reputation as one of the Corps' most reliable and effective officers. She'd earned her captain's bars through dedication, courage, and an unwavering commitment to her Marines.
She wouldn't let ancient history undermine that now.
The tent flap opened, and she found herself face to face with Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Reed for the first time since the terrible day in Baghdad when everything had fallen apart.
He looked older, she noted clinically.
The boyish features she remembered had been weathered by years of desert sun and combat stress. His hair was graying at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But his bearing was still unmistakably military, and when their eyes met, she felt the same electric shock she'd experienced the first time they'd met. "Captain Chen," he said, his voice carefully neutral.
"Please, have a seat." Sarah entered the tent and took the offered chair across from Reed's field desk.
The space was cramped but organized, with tactical maps covering every available surface and radio equipment humming quietly in the background. It looked exactly like every other command post she'd ever seen, but somehow the presence of Marcus Reed made it feel charged with unspoken tension. "I've read the preliminary reports from your unit," Reed continued, consulting a folder on his desk.
"It sounds like you walked into a significant enemy concentration." Can you walk me through what happened from the beginning?
Sarah launched into her professional account of the morning's events, describing the patrol route, the discovery of the weapons cache, and the subsequent enemy contact. She kept her voice steady and factual, focusing on tactical details and avoiding any reference to the personal history that hung between them like a minefield. The weapons cache was larger than anything we'd encountered in this sector, she explained, pulling out a digital camera and showing Reed the photographs she'd taken before the attack. At least 24 AK-47s, several RPGs, and what appeared to be components for improvised explosive devices.
Someone was planning something significant. Reed studied the photographs with the intense concentration she remembered from their time in Iraq.
He'd always had the ability to see patterns and connections that others missed, to think several moves ahead of both his enemies and his allies. It was one of the things that had made him such an effective commander, and one of the reasons she'd been so drawn to him. This changes the intelligence picture for this entire region, Reed said finally. We've been treating this area as relatively stable, but this suggests a much more significant Taliban presence than we realized.
Yes, sir.
I've recommended increased patrols and a thorough search of the surrounding area. There may be other caches we haven't discovered yet. Reed made notes on his tactical map, marking the location of the weapons cache and the enemy position Sarah had identified during the firefight. His movements were economical and precise, every gesture serving a specific purpose. Sarah found herself remembering the way he'd worked in his command post in Fallujah, the same focused intensity that had made her feel like she was watching a master craftsman at work. Your casualties, Reed said, looking up from the map. I know this isn't easy, but I need you to walk me through exactly what happened to each of them. Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the details that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Corporal Martinez had been hit by sniper fire while trying to establish a defensive perimeter. Johnson had taken shrapnel from a mortar round while dragging a wounded Marine to safety. Private Williams had been killed instantly by a direct hit from an RPG while operating the squad's machine gun.
Williams was just 19, Sarah said, her voice catching slightly despite her efforts to remain professional. Joined the Corps straight out of high school in Iowa. Wanted to save money for college. Reed's expression softened almost imperceptibly. He died protecting his fellow Marines. That means something. Does it? The words slipped out before Sarah could stop them, carrying years of accumulated grief and frustration. Does it really mean anything to his parents back in Iowa? Does it mean anything to Martinez's wife and kids? Reed was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah realized she'd crossed a line. Officers didn't question the meaning of sacrifice, not in front of their superiors. But Reed had always been different, more willing to engage with the human cost of their profession than most commanders. I don't know, he said finally. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't. All I know is that good Marines died today doing their duty, and that has to count for something, even if we can't always see what that something is. Sarah nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the firefight and the helicopter ride back to base was wearing off, leaving her feeling hollowed out and fragile. She wanted nothing more than to find a quiet corner somewhere and process everything that had happened, but she knew there were still hours of debriefing and paperwork ahead of her. There's something else we need to discuss, Reed said, his voice taking on a more formal tone. Your call sign. Phantom 7. That's not standard Marine Corps nomenclature. Sarah felt her cheeks flush. She'd hoped he wouldn't ask about that. The call sign was something she'd chosen years ago, a private reference to a shared memory from Iraq that she'd thought no one would recognize. It was foolish and sentimental, but it had helped her feel connected to something larger than herself during the loneliest moments of her career. It's a personal choice, sir. Within regulations. I know where it comes from, Reed said quietly, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Of course he knew. The memory was probably as vivid for him as it was for her. The night they'd spent talking in the abandoned palace in Baghdad, sharing stories about their families and their fears and their dreams. He'd told her about the phantom tanks his grandfather had described from World War II, invisible units that appeared where they were needed most and disappeared when their job was done.
Sir, I can explain. There's nothing to explain, Captain. You're an outstanding officer, and your choice of call sign is your business.
I just wanted you to know that I remember. The simple statement hung between them, loaded with 15 years of unspoken history.
Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back angrily.
She was a Marine officer, not some lovesick teenager.
She could handle this situation with professionalism and dignity.
Is there anything else you need from me for the debriefing, sir?
Reed hesitated for a moment, and Sarah could see him struggling with something.
Finally, he shook his head. That's all for now, Captain. Get some rest. I'll need a full written report by 1800 hours. Sarah stood and saluted crisply. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
She turned to leave, but Reed's voice stopped her at the tent entrance.
Sarah.
She turned back, noting that he'd used her first name for the first time since she'd arrived. For what it's worth, you did good work out there today.
Your Marines are lucky to have you. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak.
She pushed through the tent flap and walked across the compound toward her quarters, her mind reeling from everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, she'd lost 3 Marines, survived a major firefight, and come face to face with the one person she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. As she walked, she could feel eyes following her from various points around the base. Word of the morning's action was already spreading, and she knew that her performance would be scrutinized and analyzed by every Marine on the base. That was part of the job, part of the responsibility that came with wearing the captain's bars on her collar. But, right now, all she could think about was the look in Marcus Reed's eyes when he'd said her name. After all these years, after everything that had happened between them, he could still make her feel like that young lieutenant who'd fallen in love with her commanding officer in the middle of a war zone. The realization terrified her more than any enemy ambush ever could. 3 days after the firefight, Sarah Chin found herself standing outside the base medical facility at 0500 hours, watching the sun rise over the Afghan mountains. She'd been coming here every morning since the battle, checking on her wounded Marines and struggling with the guilt that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Sergeant Patterson was stable now, his leg wound healing properly despite the infection that had set in during the first 48 hours. Lance Corporal Davis had already been evacuated to Germany for specialized treatment on his traumatic brain injury. The others were recovering, but Sarah knew that some wounds went deeper than what the medical corps could treat. "You're up early, Captain." Sarah turned to find Colonel Reed approaching from the direction of the command center, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He looked like he hadn't slept much either, and she wondered if he was dealing with his own version of the guilt that kept her awake at night. "Couldn't sleep, sir. Thought I'd check on my Marines." Reed offered her one of the coffee cups, and she accepted it gratefully. The morning air was cold, and the warmth felt good against her hands. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the base come to life around them as early shift personnel began their routines. "Patterson's asking when he can return to duty," Sarah said finally. "The doctors want to keep him here for at least another week, but he's convinced he's ready to go back to the field." "Good Marines always think they're ready before they actually are," Reed replied. "It's our job to keep them from hurting themselves with their own eagerness." Sarah nodded, remembering her own impatience during her recovery from a roadside bomb injury in Iraq. She'd been convinced that her unit needed her, that she was letting them down by lying in a hospital bed. It had taken Reed's intervention to keep her from checking herself out of the medical facility before she was properly healed. "I've been thinking about the weapons cache," she said, shifting the conversation to safer ground. "The sophistication of some of those components suggests outside support. This wasn't just local Taliban forces." Reed's expression grew more serious. "Intelligence agrees with your assessment. We've identified several components that could only have come from Pakistan or Iran. Someone with significant resources is backing the local insurgents. What does that mean for our operations here?" "It means everything just got more complicated." Reed pulled out a folded map and spread it on a nearby equipment crate. "We've identified 3 other potential cache sites based on your intelligence. I'm putting together a task force to investigate them systematically. Sarah studied the map, noting the locations Reed had marked. They formed a rough triangle around the forward operating base, suggesting a coordinated effort to surround and, potentially cut off American forces in the region.
"You want my unit to lead the searches," she said. It wasn't a question. She could read the tactical situation as clearly as Reed could. "Your people know the terrain now, and they've proven they can handle unexpected contact." "But, Sarah..." Reed paused, using her first name again despite the formal setting. "I need to know you're ready for this. What happened 3 days ago was traumatic for everyone involved." "If you need more time, my Marines are ready, sir," Sarah interrupted, perhaps more sharply than she intended. "We've dealt with losses before. We know how to compartmentalize and focus on the mission." Reed studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see right through her professional facade. He'd always been able to read her better than she liked, even back in Iraq when she thought she was being subtle about her growing feelings for him. "I'm not questioning your Marines' readiness, Captain. I'm questioning yours." The blunt statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to protest, to assert her fitness for duty, but Reed held up a hand to stop her. "3 nights ago, I watched you carry Private Williams' body to the medical evacuation helicopter. I saw your face when you realized he was gone. That kind of loss leaves marks, Sarah, whether we want to admit it or not." Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "With respect, sir, every officer in this corps has carried dead Marines. It's part of the job. If we stopped functioning every time we lost people, we'd never accomplish anything." "You're right," Reed said quietly. "But that doesn't make it easier, and it doesn't mean we should ignore the human cost of what we do." They stood in silence again, and Sarah found herself remembering another conversation they'd had 15 years ago, in the ruins of a bombed-out school in Fallujah. Reed had found her there after a particularly difficult patrol, sitting among the scattered children's books and trying to process the violence she'd witnessed. He'd sat with her for hours, not saying much, just being present while she worked through her emotions. It had been the beginning of the end for both of them, that moment of vulnerability that had opened the door to something neither of them had intended. Sarah had been married to David then, a promising young officer stationed at Camp Pendleton who deserved better than a wife who was falling in love with another man. Reed had been married too, to a woman who had already sacrificed so much for his career. "I got a letter from David yesterday," Sarah said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission. "He's been tracking my deployments through the military network. He wanted me to know he's proud of what I'm doing here." Reed's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "That's good. It's important to have support from home." "We've been divorced for 8 years now," Sarah continued, not sure why she was sharing this information. "He remarried 3 years ago. Has 2 kids with his new wife. Seems happy. Are you happy for him?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "Yes, I think I am. He deserved someone who could give him their whole heart, not someone who was carrying baggage from a war zone." Reed turned to face her fully, his expression intense. "Sarah, what happened between us in Iraq was a mistake," Sarah finished quickly, before he could say something they'd both regret. "We were both under enormous stress, dealing with things that most people never have to face. We made choices that hurt people we cared about. End of story. Is it really that simple for you?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah felt 15 years of carefully suppressed emotions threatening to surface. She'd spent so much time convincing herself that what they'd shared had been nothing more than a wartime romance, a brief moment of madness in an insane situation. But, standing here with him now, she could feel the same magnetic pull that had drawn them together in Iraq. "It has to be simple," she said finally. "Because the alternative is too complicated to live with." Reed nodded slowly, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "I understand. And you're right, of course. We both have responsibilities now that go beyond whatever personal history we might share." "Yes, sir. We do. Then, let's focus on the mission." Reed refolded the map and straightened his uniform. I want your unit ready to move out at 0800 tomorrow. You'll have air support on standby and a quick reaction force positioned for backup. The first cache site is approximately 6 kilometers northeast of your previous contact area. Understood, sir. My Marines will be ready. Reed started to walk away, then turned back one more time. Sarah? Be careful out there. I can't. He paused, struggling with words. Just be careful. Sarah watched him walk back toward the command center, his shoulders squared with the weight of command. She knew what he'd been trying to say, what he couldn't allow himself to articulate. The same fear that kept her awake at night, the terror that something might happen to him while she was powerless to protect him. She finished her coffee and headed back to her quarters to brief her Marines for the next day's mission. Professional distance, she reminded herself. That was the only way this could work. She was Captain Sarah Chen, and he was Colonel Marcus Reed, and whatever had existed between them 15 years ago would have to stay buried in the past where it belonged. But, as she walked across the compound, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of the look in Reed's eyes when he'd told her to be careful. After all these years, after all the pain they'd caused each other and the people they'd loved, he still cared what happened to her. The realization should have been comforting, but, instead, it made her feel more alone than ever. That evening, as Sarah conducted her final equipment checks and reviewed the mission parameters with her squad leaders, she found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. The decision to join the Marines straight out of college. The choice to request deployment to Iraq despite David's objections. The moment of weakness that had led her into Reed's arms and ultimately destroyed her marriage. Every choice had consequences, and every consequence led to new choices. Tomorrow, she would lead her Marines into danger again, knowing that some of them might not come back. That was the burden of command, the weight that came with the responsibility of making life and death decisions for other people. But, tonight, for just a few hours, she allowed herself to remember what it had felt like to be loved by Marcus Reed, and to wonder what might have been if they'd been different people in a different time and place. It was a luxury she rarely permitted herself, but, in the quiet hours before another dangerous mission, it felt like the only thing keeping her human. The attack came at dawn on the fourth day, just as Reed's intelligence reports had predicted. Sarah was reviewing patrol schedules in her quarters when the first mortar rounds hit the perimeter, sending shockwaves through the forward operating base that rattled windows and set off car alarms across the compound. She grabbed her gear and weapon, racing toward the command center as Marines poured out of buildings throughout the base. The sound of incoming artillery was unmistakable, a whistling shriek followed by explosive impacts that sent dirt and debris flying in all directions. This wasn't random harassing fire, it was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the base's defenses. Phantom 7, report to command immediately, Reed's voice crackled over her radio as she sprinted across the compound, dodging falling debris and the occasional small arms fire from infiltrators who had somehow breached the outer perimeter. Sarah burst into the command tent to find controlled chaos. Radio operators were coordinating defensive positions while intelligence analysts tried to determine the size and scope of the attacking force. Reed stood at the center of it all, calm and focused despite the violence erupting around them. "Captain, I need your unit to reinforce the eastern perimeter," Reed said without preamble. "We've got approximately 60 Taliban fighters trying to breach the wire, and they're using the weapons cache network you discovered to coordinate their assault." Sarah nodded, already mentally calculating the best deployment for her Marines. "What about air support?" "Inbound, but they're hitting us from multiple directions. The pilots are having trouble distinguishing between friendly and enemy positions in this terrain." Another series of explosions rocked the base, closer this time. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 fire mixing with the heavier sound of Marine M4 rifles as the perimeter defenders engaged the attacking force. "Sir, my Marines are ready. Where do you need us?" Reed pointed to a position on the tactical map where red markers indicated heavy enemy contact. "Tower 7 is reporting at least 20 hostiles advancing under cover of that ridgeline. They've got RPGs and are systematically targeting our defensive positions." Sarah studied the map quickly, noting the approaches and potential fields of fire.
It was a dangerous assignment, requiring her unit to advance across open ground while under direct fire, but it was also the kind of mission her Marines had trained for extensively.
"We can do it, sir. Give us 15 minutes. Sarah."
Reed's voice stopped her as she turned to leave.
When she looked back, his expression was uncharacteristically vulnerable.
"I know I have no right to ask this, but please be careful out there.
I can't lose."
He stopped himself, but Sarah understood what he'd been about to say. "I'll bring my Marines home, sir."
"All of them."
Sarah raced back to her unit's position, where Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was already organizing the Marines for defensive action. Her squad leaders had anticipated the order and were preparing their men for movement under fire. "Listen up," Sarah called, gathering her Marines around her.
"We're moving to reinforce Tower 7.
Enemy forces are advancing with heavy weapons, and they're using our own intelligence against us. This is going to be dangerous, but we know this terrain better than they do." She outlined the tactical situation quickly, assigning specific roles to each fire team.
Sergeant Patterson, recently returned to duty despite his leg injury, would lead the assault element.
Corporal Davis would coordinate with the air support once it arrived.
Lance Corporal Morrison would establish overwatch positions to protect their flanks.
"Remember what happened to Martinez, Johnson, and Williams," Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the group.
"We're not going to let their sacrifice be meaningless. We're going to stop these bastards here and now."
The Marines responded with the fierce determination she'd come to expect from them. These were combat veterans who had been tested under fire and proven themselves capable of extraordinary things when their brothers were in danger. The movement to Tower 7 was a nightmare of explosions and gunfire.
Sarah's unit advanced by bounds, using every piece of available cover as mortar rounds continued to fall around them.
The enemy had clearly studied the base layout carefully, targeting key defensive positions with precision that spoke of inside intelligence or extensive reconnaissance. Phantom 7 to base command, Sarah radioed as her unit took position in a drainage ditch 50 meters from Tower 7.
"We're in position and can see the enemy advance.
I count approximately 25 hostiles moving up the eastern slope, armed with RPGs and automatic weapons."
"Roger, Phantom 7. Viper flight is 30 seconds out. Paint your targets."
Sarah deployed her laser designator and began marking enemy positions for the incoming air support. Through her binnacle,